Hello again, YouTube. It's me, Logan Albright, back with another book review. And like I promised last week, this week I'm doing another novel and not a strange top 5 list of some psychologist that you probably don't care about. So this week's novel is Starship Troopers by Robert Heinlein. Robert Heinlein is one of my favorite science fiction writers, and I've done a number of his books on the channel before. I've talked about The Moon is a Harsh Mistress and Time Enough for Love, and I think Starman Jones as well. But I hadn't read Starship Troopers before, and it's his most famous novel, probably. Maybe Stranger in a Strange Land is as famous, but they're pretty close, which I have read, but I haven't done it on the channel. But I wanted to read it. I have a friend who really liked it, so I thought it would be good. And I read it, and man, I was not disappointed. Starship Troopers is justifiably a classic, and it came out in 1959. It was sort of his first novel after his juvenile period when he was writing children's books for kids, like space adventures for kids. He wanted to do something a little bit more weighty, a little bit more heavy, and that's what Starship Troopers is. It's a military adventure that takes place in the future and has a spaceship component to it, a space travel component. The main character, Johnny Rico, enlists in the military and goes through training and is signed up to fight in a war against these kind of insectoid aliens that, the war is sort of unspecified, like the nature of the war and why the war is going on, but there's a war between the humans and these insectoid aliens who are called bugs in the novel. It's kind of a slangy, derogatory term for them. And you learn all about the military and societal structure of this future society. And there's a lot of philosophy in here. And there's a lot of thinking about the nature of democracy and the nature of military expansion and all these things that Heinlein delves very deeply into. Now, the book is a little bit controversial because a lot of people find its ideas objectionable, and a lot of people think that Robert Heinlein is a bit of a fascist for what he writes in this book, because the society portrayed is extremely militaristic. Every citizen, if they want to vote, has to enlist in the military. Otherwise, you're not allowed to vote if you don't spend time in the military. And the military officers who are conducting the training give a lot of speeches about how violence is necessary in order to, keep the peace in the universe, and that the only thing that really accomplishes anything or changes anything in the long run is force, and that it's sort of a kill or be killed world, that the humans have to expand across the galaxy and make their footprint as large as it can be, otherwise some other race will come and step on them and squash them. And so it's got kind of this war of all against all, kill or be killed, might makes right theory behind a lot of what is said in the book. Now, it's difficult to tell how much of this is Robert Heinlein's own view, how much of it is the characters that he's speaking view, because a lot of the characters giving these speeches are military officers, and you would expect them to have these views. There's another character who gives a pretty severe harangue against the military and says that it's the refuge of lazy people who are useless and don't want to do anything useful with society, and they want to live at the expense of the taxpayer. So there's kind of differing points of view in there. I will say that I was a little surprised reading this book because I had seen the movie Starship Troopers, which directed by Paul Verhoeven, and that's treated very satirically. All these ideas of kind of militarism is treated as sort of a critique of that sort of mindset and philosophy. And it's treated a little bit sarcastically and say, this is clearly wrong, but they're portraying it to show that it's wrong. And I expected that to be true in the book as well, but it's really not. The book pretty much plays it straight. And like I said, it's hard to tell whether these are the author's views or whether these are the views of the characters, or whether he's just kind of playing around with these ideas and experimenting with them using fiction as a means to come to terms with what he's thinking about civic duty and the military and things like that. So it's hard to tell. I know from his later writings that he's quite a libertarian writer in most of his books that he writes about. He's very critical of the government. He's very in favor of free cooperation and free enterprise and unregulated economy. I will say that the critics of Heinlein who describe him as fascist, I think that's inaccurate. And even if you take everything that he says in this book at face value, we're not told very much about the economy of the planet, but it appears to be fairly laissez-faire, and they say that taxes are light, regulation is low, and so that's not really fascism. It's just militarism and expansionism, which is not necessarily good, but it's not really fascism. I studied economics, so it annoys me when people use the term fascism wrong. Fascism is an economic system, and militarism is a component of it, but it's not every militaristic society is by definition fascist. So we got that out of the way. But it's like I feel like these views in this book conflict a little bit with his sort of later libertarian views, and maybe his views evolved, or maybe it doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, I don't really care what the author thinks. I care about how good the book is and how thought-provoking the book is. And the book is very thought-provoking. It's very philosophical, and it makes you consider about the franchise. Like he has a long speech about who should be allowed to vote, and the reason that they only allow the military service members to vote and the civilians not to vote is because the people who have voluntarily enlisted in the military have shown through their actions that they are willing to put the good of the society and the good of the civilization above their own personal good. And so that's what qualifies them to vote, which is an interesting idea. And he's critical of letting everybody vote. Universal suffrage he thinks is a bad thing in this, or the characters in the novel say that that's a bad thing and that it didn't work out in the 20th century. So that's pretty interesting to think about. And I'm not sure that I agree with it, but it's something that's worth considering. And that's what I like about science fiction, is you can play around with these ideas and you don't have to agree with them, and you don't have to disagree with them. You can just think about them and say, oh, that's an interesting take. And I think people have this tendency to think, well, if I disagree with an idea, I automatically can't enjoy the book or can't like the book. And it's like, well, no. I mean, I disagree with a lot of what is said in this book, but I still thought it was a fantastic adventure story and very thought-provoking. And that's what good books should do. They should make you think and make you question things, and you don't have to agree with them in order to enjoy them. And this is justifiably a classic because it's a very gripping tale of this one, soldier's journey and what he goes through and the things he experiences. And it's actually surprisingly light on action. Like there's not a ton of battles in this book. It's like kind of bookended at the beginning and the end with battles, but most of what is talked about in the book is basic training. And so it's a lot like that first half of Full Metal Jacket, that Stanley Kubrick film, which I love, showing how hard it is and how difficult basic training is, and what goes into that. And Heinlein himself was a military man, and he knows what he speaks of. So that's why I think that there's a lot of similarities between that film and this book, is that both people writing those things knew what they were talking about in terms of what basic training is actually like. And so it's probably I haven't been in the military, so it probably bears a lot of resemblance to what it is really like, although I don't know from first-hand experience because I haven't experienced that. But it's fascinating to read about, and it's interesting that a space adventure with space marines is so light on the actual combat, and it's so focused on the kind of philosophy of the military and the basic training rather than those other things. This was written in the middle of the Cold War, and you can kind of see some allegorical parallels between what's going on here and what's going on in the Cold War in real time. The insect enemy that they are fighting are very collectivist, and they have sort of a hive mind. They basically operate like ants. There's a caste system where you have the workers and you have the soldiers and you have the brains and you have the queen, and they all serve different functions, and none of them can really function without the others telling them what to do. It's sort of anti-individualistic, and that's the enemy in the book. So it's easy to draw a parallel between that and the communism that was the subject of the Cold War during the 1950s and much of the 20th century. So that is an interesting parallel as well. But it's just I don't know. I just found the book utterly gripping. I think that it's very tightly written, very well paced. You're sympathizing with the hero. You want to see what happens. And I was surprised at how little combat there was, and I was surprised at how little satire there was. It was pretty straightforward, but it definitely is a step forward from the more juvenile adventures that he had been writing before this, and moving into something more adult, more philosophical, more thought-provoking. It really you can see how it paves the way for books like Stranger in a Strange Land or The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, where he's playing around with political ideas that are a little bit more extreme and a little bit more, all of his ideas in all of his books are fairly extreme, and that's what I like about him, is he's pushing the envelope. He's using fiction, and particularly science fiction, the way it's meant to be used, as a vehicle to kind of test the limits of ideas and see where they take you. So, Heinlein is famously or infamously sort of obsessed with sexual taboos, and a lot of his books deal with the ideas of like polyamory or incest or the relationships between very young and very old people, and things that are generally frowned upon in 20th century American sexual mores. And so there's none of that in this book. He hasn't gotten there yet. This book is very clean in that respect. But, you can see how he's interested in sort of pushing those ideas, these kind of controversial, slightly upsetting ideas that people maybe don't want to think about too deeply. And he delves into that here, and then he delves into this idea of like who should be able to vote, what does it take to make a good democratic society that works and doesn't just become a dictatorship of the majority, or doesn't just become a system of people leeching off the taxpayer. And you can tell that he's interested in these things and he's playing around with them. And I don't know whether he reached any definite conclusions about that. And certainly I think that there's ideas in this book that conflict with the ideas in his later books. But, he's playing around and he's coming up with thoughts about these things. And I think that's great. That's what I love about science fiction. I complained in an earlier video I did about a book by Paul Anderson, Three Hearts and Three Lions. And I said it was an enjoyable adventure, but the problem with fantasy as opposed to science fiction is that fantasy tends to be less idea focused. It tends to be less like a series of little adventures. And adventures are fun, but like I feel like there's all this scope to expand that and be more ideas focused in your writing. And this is a great example of how it's not just a space adventure where we go kill the bad guys and there's lasers and there's spaceships and there's aliens and stuff. Like it actually delves into some really interesting ideas and really difficult ideas and things that require you to think and challenge some of your preconceptions. And so I don't think that Heinlein was a fascist. I think Heinlein may have had some kind of pro-military ideas that I would not necessarily agree with, but I think that they're interesting ideas and they're worth considering. I think all ideas are basically worth considering if they're thought out. And that's the beauty of having freedom of speech and having the ability to express things that, they may be terrible ideas, but we don't know what the good ideas and what the bad ideas are until we hash them out and talk them over and think them through thoroughly. And so that's a beautiful thing about novels and fiction and science fiction, is that it's a vehicle for us to kind of explore not just imaginary worlds, but imaginary ideas about how society might be structured, how it could be structured differently, whether that would be better, whether that would be worse. And that's one of the most appealing things about the genre as far as I can tell. But I can just say without reservation that Starship Troopers was tremendously entertaining. It's very different from the film, but it's just a great space adventure, and it contains a lot of the archetypes of these kind of space marine tropes that we have today, things like powered armor. Like Heinlein basically invented those ideas. And so this is tremendously influential. If you're into military adventures, if you're into science fiction adventures, this is definitely a must-read. It's fairly short, it's fast-paced, it's gripping, you can get through it quickly, but just a delight. And I always look forward to reading more of Heinlein's books. He's got many, many novels that I haven't read yet, so I will tackle more of them. If you have a favorite, please let me know down in the comments below which one I should read next, and I will attempt to tackle it. Also, any other science fiction writers or writers of any genre, really, that you think I would enjoy, please let me know in the comments down below. And if you enjoyed this review of Starship Troopers, which I highly recommend once again, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, click the bell for notifications, do all those things you're supposed to do. You've been on YouTube long enough to know the drill by now. And I will catch you next time with another book review, provided that I am able to read. I'm going to be out of the country next week, so I may not get as much reading done as I ordinarily would, but I'm going to get back to you just as soon as I can with some more book reviews, because I'm reading a lot of really interesting things right now, and I want to talk about them. But until next time, I've been Logan Albright. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you later.